Thank you very much. First, I apologize for speaking English. I'm probably the only person in this room who doesn't speak Swedish, so you're all going to have to talk in English. My apologies, I was too stupid to learn Swedish. So, I'm delighted that big history, aspects of big history are being taught in the school. I personally, as you'll see, think that big history is something we really need in modern education. Now, I have a PowerPoint. I want to try to get through it in 45 minutes, so let me get straight into it. This is the cover of the Swedish translation of my latest book, Origin Story, which will come out in November, yes. I believe. This is the English version, and the English version is called Origin Story. And I'll try to explain why I think the idea of origin stories is important. So, what does this book try to do? Well, the project it's engaged in is one that has been of interest to intellectuals and philosophers and historians and big thinkers since the 18th century, since the Enlightenment. And the project, as I understand it, is to build a modern, science-based origin story. So let me explain what I understand by origin stories. In all human societies that we know of, until the modern era, it seems that people tried to take all of the best knowledge of that society, and I'm including indigenous societies. I live in Australia, so traditional societies in Australia, they took all their best knowledge accumulated over many generations, and they distilled it into stories that could be used to teach young people, so that young people would have a sort of understanding of the best knowledge of that society, and a sort of map of their society, of the world, and of the universe, so that they could place themselves. They knew what their place was in something larger. The Christian origin story did this. Isaac Newton wrote his science within an origin story. It was the Christian origin story. Buddhism, Islam, all the great religions have done this. So I think the idea of the Enlightenment was that modern science was suddenly looking so impressive that they thought, can we build a new origin story that is based not just on revelation or ancient books or ancient traditions, but on science, on a new and better and more powerful form of knowledge. Now that would have to be a story that would bring together what science told us about the origins of the universe, the origins of planet Earth, the origins of life on Earth, the evolution of life, the evolution of humans, and the history of humans, brought it all together. And it would end up talking, of course, about our own very strange species of animal, Homo sapiens. And this a species which is now beginning to rule an entire planet. And that's a major turning point in the history of this planet, of planet Earth. So Origin Story is a more recent attempt to tell this modern origin story. Now, let me briefly talk about the history of this origin story, because in the 18th century and the 19th century, many big thinkers tried to do this. They tried to do what today we call big history. I could list all of them, but the big systematic thinkers of the 19th century, Hegel, Kant, Marx, of course, Alexander von Humboldt, all were trying to do this. And then in the late 19th century, suddenly, everywhere in the world, people stopped trying to do this. And what happened was the whole world of knowledge and education changed. And what was created was the world that you live in and that I live in. It's a world in which knowledge is based on disciplines. There's this discipline and this discipline and that discipline, and you look at reality through a series of holes, and they're not connected. we don't have a modern origin story. We entered a world in which the idea of a coherent origin story was abandoned. We gained an immense amount of new knowledge in the 20th century, but it was within the disciplines. And we lost the unified vision of an origin story. So we entered a world in which we all learnt that knowledge comes in bits and pieces. It's fragmented. There is no unity to it. And that in many ways is dangerous, because it means you have this feeling of not being sure what it is you're part of. Now, I personally believe that there actually is a modern origin story within modern science, and it's our job to try to see that story. And that's really what big history tries to do. And there's a reason why we can do it now better than they did in the 19th century. And that's because we have the science is so much better. If you think of an image with pixels, millions of pixels, today we have a lot more pixels. So the story is much better. So now we can tell it better than in the 19th century. And, as I'll show you, we need the very wide-angle lens of big history. It's not enough to look at reality through this hole and that hole and this hole. We need the wide-angle lens to see some very big things that are very important. Now, Bill Gates has been immensely supportive of this big history project, and this is what he said about it when he came across the idea of big history. I wish everyone could take this course. Big history literally tells the story of the universe from the very beginning to the complex societies we have today. It shows, and this is the crucial thing, it shows how everything is connected. And I hope those of you who've been looking at big history are beginning to understand that it shows you connections between different sorts of knowledge. It weaves together insights and evidence from so many disciplines into a single, understandable story. Insights from astronomy, physics, chemistry, biology, anthropology, history, economics, and more. When I came across these lectures a few years ago, they really blew me away. It made me wish I could have taken big history when I was young. And I think I felt the same thing. I wished I could have done big history when I was young. So the only alternative was to try to write big history, which is sort of what I did. Okay, so what can a modern origin story help you do? It can provide a sort of map of everything, in fact, multiple maps, and it can help you understand who you are by understanding multiple identities. So here's a very simple way of describing this. Knowing who you are means mapping yourself onto multiple linked identities. So we all think of ourselves as a self. There's me, right, in the universe. Then there's a family. I belong to a family. I'm part of a family. That's a second identity. Then I may belong to a village or a clan or a tribe or a workplace or a school. That's another identity. Then beyond that, in today's world, we have national identities. So you're aware of yourself as Swedish. Some of you may be aware of other national identities in your background, your parents' national identities. And that's an identity that's very well developed in today's world, is the national identity. But it's sort of dangerous, I think, in a world with nuclear weapons to focus too much on our national identities. Because beyond that, there is the fact that we are all humans. And in today's world, which is so globalized, and with nuclear weapons and problems that we all share, thinking of ourselves as human beings is immensely important, and understanding our identity as human beings. And if you think about it, that's an identity that's not very well developed in modern education or modern intellectual life. And it's one that I think we very much need to develop, and big history can help you develop it. And then beyond that, we are not just human beings, we are members of a huge community of different living organisms that's evolved over 4 billion years. We're part of the biosphere.
The microphone turned off.
The microphone turned off. I'm wondering if it may have run out of battery.
Var finns...
Okay, now it's on. Now it's on.
Now it's on.
Okay,
Good.
so tell me if it switches off again. Okay, so we're also part of the biosphere. And we're kind of a rogue species because we're having a huge impact on the biosphere, and we need to be aware of that. And we belong to an Earth, to a planet, and then beyond that, we're part of a universe. And what Big History can do is help you see all of these identities so you know what it is that you are part of. There's some larger thing that you're part of, and that's a very powerful part of understanding what you are. Now, how do you put together a modern origin story? Well, it's a bit like quilt making. I'm realizing there are one or two. I think this is a slightly different version of the PowerPoint than I sent. There are one or two slides that I'm missing here, but anyway, let's go with this. How do you assemble a modern origin story? Well, it's a bit like quilt making. It's a bit like putting a quilt together. So what I did when I began thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to put together a story, a history of the universe? I thought, I'll talk to the astronomers, I'll talk to the physicists, I'll talk to the geographers, I'll talk to the geologists, I'll talk to the biologists and the historians. And I'll take all of their stories and I'll try to put them together as if I was building a quilt. We tried to do this first in 1989 at Macquarie University in Sydney. And what we did was we invited lecturers from many different disciplines. So I phoned up an astronomer in our university and I said, would you be able to give a lecture, 1 hour lecture, summarizing your entire discipline? And some people said, I don't think so. I think that's kind of crazy. Other people said, fantastic, I'd love to. And those, of course, were the people I asked. So we got all these different lecturers to give lectures. And I sat through them all, but it was hard to see a coherent story. Each of them talked. They used their own jargon. The astronomers talked about electromagnetic radiation. The geologists talked about metamorphic rocks. And my poor students often were completely confused. So it was a bit of a patchwork. It was a bit of a mess. And at first I thought maybe this project won't work. But it was my students who said to me, we may not be seeing a clear story, but the idea of trying to put it all together is wonderful. So please keep doing that. So we got lots of students, and that is why we carried on doing it. And then over several years, it's happened again. Yeah. Okay.
No, they must fix it.
My apologies.
So,
Modern technology. Okay. Okay. So, then something magical happened. Over the next few years, I listened to all of these lectures, and gradually what began to happen, it was a bit like being in an old photographic lab, where you put in a piece of paper and you've exposed it, and you suddenly watch a white piece of paper and a photograph, a picture appears. So it was quite magical what happened. A story appeared. I began to see a clear story. There is a coherent story that links all these different parts. And what I'd like to try to do is to give you some sense of the shape of that story. Some of you may already have a sense of it. So first, the story has a plot, like every good story. And the plot is really fairly simple. The plot goes like this. In the early universe was very, very simple. There was nothing very complicated in it. The most complicated things were probably atoms. But over 13.8 billion years, what happened is that more and more complex things appeared in the universe, until today we have the fantastically complex society that you and I live in. So that's the story. How do you get from a simple early universe to today's world? So let me explain what I mean. About 400,000 years after the Big Bang, the universe, you can think of a thin mist of hydrogen and helium atoms. It was all very smooth, very homogeneous. Everything was at exactly the same temperature. We know that because we can measure temperature differences in the early universe in the cosmic background radiation. And the difference between the red areas and the blue areas is about 100,000th of a degree. So this is very smooth, very simple. There's not much structure, there's not much shape. There are no galaxies and stars, there are no heavier chemical elements, just hydrogen and helium. There are no planets, there are certainly no living organisms, there are no cockroaches, there are no iPhones, there are no internets, no computers, none of that. Then, over 13.8 billion years, more complex things appeared, step by step. And that's the story we describe. Now, we need to be clear, most of the universe today is very, very simple. If I picked you up and I threw you out into the universe, you'd find yourself in a place that's completely empty, very uninteresting, very cold, and you would not live for long. But there are special places in the universe where the conditions are just right to allow the creation of more complex things, where there are Goldilocks conditions. Do you know the children's story of Goldilocks? Is this familiar in Sweden?
Yes.
Anyway, Goldilocks goes into the three bears' house, and she finds some porridge, and one bowl is too hot, the other is too cold, but one is just right. So in some parts of the universe, you get conditions that are just right for creating more complex things, like the early Earth. And new complex things emerge, and they have new qualities. Think of the fact that for many billions of years, there was no life in the universe, no life of any kind. Then suddenly, life appeared, something with completely new qualities. And when it happens, it's always magical. It's like watching a baby being born. So this is what we watch, these steps, when something new appears, and each time it's magical. And eventually what it creates is the extreme complexity of the world that you and I live in today. So it's about our world. How did the universe create things like us? Now, the story has a bad guy, a villain. And the villain is entropy. And entropy represents the second law of thermodynamics. And the second law is the law that says that everything will break down. If you leave your bedroom for a month, it'll get dirtier and dirtier and messier over time. That's entropy at work. So entropy loves to break everything down. Whenever you get anything interesting or complex or beautiful, entropy loves to bust it, to break it down. And eventually, entropy will break down everything in the universe. Here's a sort of poetic description of how evil entropy is. And this comes from the writer on mythology, Joseph Campbell. The world as we know it, writes Joseph Campbell, yields but one ending: death, disintegration, dismemberment, and the crucifixion of our heart with the passing of the forms that we have loved. So entropy is the bad guy. Entropy tries to break everything down. So here's the puzzle. If entropy is so powerful, how is it possible for more complex things to appear? I hope you see that the creation of our world is a miraculous thing in a world shaped by entropy. Now, modern science doesn't have terribly good answers to that question, but I can suggest some possible answers to it. One is, in the Big Bang itself, some rules appeared. And they said things like, there will be a force called gravity. Gravity will pull everything together. There will be another force called electromagnetism. It will come in two forms, positive and negative. So rules appeared in the early universe, and those rules guaranteed that our universe would have some structure and some shape. That's one answer. The second is a bit subtler, but it tells us a lot about our world. Whenever you see complex things, Think of a plane. I flew yesterday from London to here on a plane. They depend on huge flows of energy. Now, whenever a lot of energy flows, that energy eventually breaks down. It turns into heat energy. So entropy loves this, because when a lot of energy flows, things start breaking down. Think of the waste generated by a car or a plane or a big city. So in a sense, entropy loves to see complex things being created, because it knows that complex things need a lot of energy, and that energy eventually is doing entropy's work. So complex things are creating chaos in the long run. They're doing entropy's work. So we know some reasons why this puzzle is possible. Okay, now what I'd like to do is try to give you a sense of the story. And I'm going to do this by using some timelines that appear in this book. So try to give you some sense of the shape of this story. Let me explain the timelines. Over here, we have events. Now, many of these events are thresholds. In this book, to simplify the story, what I've done is I've focused on 8 thresholds of increasing complexity. These are moments when something new appeared, something more complex, something more interesting. And each threshold builds on the previous one. So these are the steps in building complexity. Threshold 1 is the Big Bang, the origin of our universe. In this column, I give a date. Now, only in the last 50 years have we been able to give good dates for events before human history. So that's one of the reasons we can tell this story now. We couldn't tell it 100 years ago. So the Big Bang happened about 13.8 billion years ago. Now, over here, I've divided the date by 1 billion. So let me explain why I've done that. Our brains are not designed to understand 1 million years or 1 billion years. And there's a very good reason. If I'm lucky, I'll live to 100. I'm not going to live to 1,000 years, or God forbid, or 1 million years. So we don't need brains that can understand 1 million years. So our brains can't really understand these long time periods. So in order to help us understand, what I've done is I've divided all the dates by 1 billion. So let's imagine the Big Bang happened 13 years and 8 or 9 months ago, and I'll keep coming back to that. Okay, so threshold 1 is the Big Bang, the creation of the universe. That's the beginning of this story. Threshold 2 is the creation of the first stars, the first really complex things in our universe. And let me describe that threshold more carefully so that you can get some sense of how these thresholds work. It's actually quite simple. You don't need to be an astrophysicist to understand this. So let me try to describe how this threshold was crossed. So let's go back to that early universe. We have hydrogen and helium atoms, this thin mist of hydrogen and helium atoms. The crucial work here is done by gravity. Gravity likes to pull things together. So what gravity does is take that thin mist of hydrogen and helium atoms and turn it into clumps. So think of the early universe as breaking into billions of clumps, and each clump is getting denser and denser and denser. And as they get denser, within each clump, the energies rise and the temperatures rise. The rest of the universe is getting cooler, but in these clumps, the energies rise and atoms and protons bang together until eventually temperatures rise to about 10 million degrees. And at that point, something magical happens, something new happens. Protons begin to fuse together. And when they fuse together, there's a huge release of energy at the center of each of these clumps. Now, this is exactly what happens in a hydrogen bomb. Protons fuse together, some of their matter turns into energy, there's a huge release of energy. Now that energy pushes back against gravity and the whole thing stabilizes, and it starts emitting light and heat into space, and you have a star. So think of the early universe all over billions and billions of stars start lighting up. And I hope you can see that a universe with stars is a much more interesting and complex place than a universe without stars. You have patterns, you have structures, you have flows of energy. So this is already a much more interesting place. So that is threshold 2. The universe is more complex. Now I'll move more quickly through the other thresholds. So threshold 1 is the Big Bang. Threshold 2 is the first stars. But we still have just hydrogen and helium. And you couldn't make you or me with just hydrogen or helium. You need carbon, you need nitrogen, you need iron, and so on. So where do you get the other elements? Well, they appear inside dying stars. And the reason is to make iron or carbon or oxygen, you need to fuse protons together. You need very high energies. So where do you find them? You find them inside dying stars. When very large stars die, the furnace at the center stops working because they've run out of protons. The star collapses so violently that temperatures rise in the center, and now suddenly you can fuse protons into the nuclei of oxygen, of nitrogen, of silicon, and up to iron. And then eventually some stars explode in supernovae, and that gives you all the other elements of the periodic table. So that's threshold 3. Now the universe is much more interesting chemically. It has 92 stable elements, and they can combine to form a fantastic diversity of different materials. That threshold probably first happened about 500 million years after the Big Bang, and it keeps happening, it's still happening. So the universe is slowly filling up with the other elements. They now make up about 2% of the atoms in the universe. Most are still hydrogen and helium. Threshold 4. Using these new materials, you can create new types of objects. You can create planets, moons, asteroids, meteorites, and solar systems. So planet Earth was created as part of threshold 4. And planet Earth was created about 4.5 billion years ago. That's about 4 years, 6 months ago on that 13-year timetable. And planet Earth, particularly rocky planets, were incredibly interesting because they were very diverse chemically. They had lots of different chemicals. They had water. They had gentle temperatures. Here you had the perfect Goldilocks conditions for rich chemistry. And this is where life appeared. Now we know life appeared on our Earth. It probably has appeared elsewhere as well, but we don't yet know. So now let's focus on Earth. Threshold 5 is the earliest life on Earth, about 3.8 billion years ago. We know that because we have little tiny fossils from Australia, from remote parts of Australia, of the very first living organisms. That's about 3 years, 9 months ago on that timetable. The first large organisms appear about 7 months ago on that timetable in the Cambrian. So that means building large organisms with many cells is much more complicated than building simple organisms, bacteria. Then, an asteroid wipes out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. That's 24 days ago on that timetable. Our species appears 200,000 years ago. That's about 100 minutes ago on this timetable. I hope you're getting a sense of the timescales involved here. And that I regard as threshold 6, the appearance of our species. Now, you may be asking, is this a sort of species bragging? Are we humans really that important in this story? Well, I'm going to try to persuade you that we are. That our appearance on planet Earth changes everything. It's immensely significant. And then 2 more thresholds. Agriculture at the end of the last ice age, that's 5 minutes ago on this time scale. Then first evidence of cities, they are 2.5 minutes ago, the Roman and Han empires, and then finally threshold 8, the fossil fuels revolution, which created our world. And that happened, as you can see, about 6 seconds ago on this 13-year timeline. Threshold 9, we don't know what it'll be. It may be the building of a sustainable world, but what's happening now is that our species is beginning to take over planet Earth. So this is a huge turning point in the history of this story. So I hope that gives you some sense of the story. In the remote future, billions and billions of years from now, entropy will finally win. The universe will get simpler again. Stars will vanish, atoms will vanish, and eventually there'll be nothing but black holes, sort of gobbling up anything that remains. But that's gazillions of years in the future. We live at a time when the universe has lots of energy and can still create really complex things. Now, I want to go back to threshold 6. That's the appearance of humans. And I want to try to persuade you that this really is a turning point in this story. So, let me explain why. All living organisms, they take in energy, and to do that they need information about their environments. So this egret has information about where to find fish for breakfast. It has information. Now, if a new species appears, its populations rise until it's using all the resources it can, and then it will stabilize. It will hit a ceiling, it stops growing, and eventually will go extinct. We humans have broken a rule that all other species observed for 4 billion years. And I think there's a very clear reason for that, and I call it collective learning. We can talk to each other with such precision and in such volume that we can exchange information. That means we're the first species in 4 billion years, 4 billion years, in which information can grow generation by generation. So in just 200,000 years, we humans have accumulated more and more information about our environment. That means we've got better and better and better at controlling energy flows. And we saw that energy flows allow the building of new things and more complex things. So this, I think, is the key to what makes us so dynamic and so powerful. We have a staggering amount of information about how to control our own surroundings, much more than any other organism that's ever lived. And that's why we're so powerful. Now, this process began in the Stone Age, in the Paleolithic, 200,000 years ago. And you can see it on this map. There's the range of chimps over there, in that area. Chimps behave normally. They evolve, they fill a niche, and they stay there. Now look at humans. Humans evolved probably somewhere in East Africa. Then, as they shared information, they learned to live in more and more different environments. They spread into other parts of Africa. They spread into Ice Age Europe. They spread into Australia. Those people, 65,000 years ago, had to have really good boats. They had a lot of knowledge. And then they arrive in Australia, completely new animals, completely new plants, and they learn to adapt to all of those environments. Then look at these people. They are living in Ice Age Siberia, not just Siberia, but Ice Age Siberia. That took a lot of skill. If I put you in Ice Age Siberia and said, you're hungry? Hunt a mammoth. No, or it's winter, survive. Could you do it? They had a lot of skill. So this map is showing humans acquiring more and more information until they spread all around the world, and they're now controlling energy in all of these parts of the world. That is a staggering achievement. No other organism has done that. Then, 10,000 years ago, agriculture. So what is agriculture and why is it so important? Well, remember at the center of the sun, there's fusion reactions. They're generating energy. The energy let's go back. The energy pours out into space. On Earth, plants capture some of that energy through photosynthesis. And then what farmers do is they change the environment. They clear forests, they divert rivers. so that you get more of the things humans can use and less of the things humans can't use. So I hope you see the end result of this. Humans are getting more of the energy and resources that's flowing through the biosphere. This is an energy grab by one species, our own. So that's why it's a threshold, a new source of energy. And what does that do? It allows human societies to get bigger, populations grow, you get villages, you get cities, you get empires, all the things that historians love to talk about. And civilizations are all of those things. But by 1800, some economists are beginning to say, we're running out of energy. Farming can't sustain growth any longer. So human growth is going to stall. Then what happens? Suddenly we discover a new source of energy. And that new source of energy is fossil fuels. And fossil fuels represent energy captured by photosynthesis and buried in the earth over 300 million years. If you rely on farming for your energy, you're relying on energy captured in the last year. If you use fossil fuels, you're using energy captured over 300 million years. So this is the increase in energy used by humans in my lifetime. Now I hope you can see how staggering is the increase in energy that we humans are using. And this is why we are now dominating the biosphere. We control so much energy that we're changing the climate, we're changing the oceans, we're transforming other species, and we now suddenly dominate the biosphere. We're so powerful that what we do in the next 50 years, and you will be in charge of planet Earth when this happens, not me, you'll be in charge of planet Earth when this happens. What we do in the next 50 years will shape the future of the biosphere for millions of years. So for the first time in 4 billion years, a single species dominates planet Earth. I hope you can see this is a pivotal moment in the history of an entire planet. Planet Earth is coming under new management. And who are the new managers? You guys. You will be the new managers. So your challenge is to manage it well, because it'll be very easy to manage it badly. Changes in the last 100 years are so colossal that it's a bit like an asteroid landing on Earth. They're changing everything. And here are just 3 measures of the change. We're beginning to transform the global climate system. In 1800, the most powerful human weapons were probably cannons. Today, we have nuclear weapons that could degrade the entire biosphere in 24 hours. If you doubt that we are powerful enough to transform the planet, just think about nuclear weapons. And our species has probably reduced the total amount of biomass of the biosphere by 50%. We're incredibly, perhaps dangerously powerful. So where are we today? Humans can share and accumulate information like no other species in the Earth's history. So we're so powerful as a result of that information that what we do in the next 50 years will shape the future of the entire biosphere. And whether or not we really understand it, we are becoming managers of planet Earth, the first managers in 4 billion years. So I hope this persuades you that this moment in planetary history is a very interesting and sort of pivotal moment. And you can only see that if you adopt the wide-angle lens of big history. So why do we need a modern origin story? So that we can see the things we need to see. And above all, so that your generation can see the things you need to see. Because we can't see these things with a sort of tunnel vision of discipline after discipline after discipline. So a modern origin story can help us see clearly our place in the universe as a product of this long story of increasing complexity, our strange role in the history of the biosphere, and the challenges we face in the next 100 or 50 or 100 years. Now, where are we with big history? Where's the project of big history? Well, I think we've achieved quite a lot in 30 years or so. It's not taught in many schools, as you know, or many universities, but we've achieved a lot. We've proved that there is a coherent origin story. That's the first thing. When I began doing this, no one knew whether there was such a story. Secondly, we've shown that the modern origin story is teachable. There are about 1,500 schools that are teaching big history using the Big History Project resources. And at Macquarie University in Sydney, we're building a primary school version of this. We've shown that learning big history can be transformative. And we've also shown that big history can generate new research agendas, because it asks scientists to think about problems that run across disciplines from cosmology to physics to human history, like the role of entropy in everything, in the universe, in human society, in history, and so on. And finally, there are now lots of resources on big history. There are academic and popular books, there are school syllabi, there are online resources. So you can do big history now in a way that was impossible 30 years ago. So, I hope we've shown that in this story, humans were pretty important. Now, let me end with this. This is maybe a cheap trick, but that's my son. The cool one with the glasses is my granddaughter, Evie Rose Molly, and that's my grandson, Daniel. They will be the people who will be running planet Earth in 30 years' time. They really need the right sort of knowledge in order to understand what are the challenges they face. And they need a sort of knowledge that embraces the sciences, the humanities, and all of these disciplines. And that's why I think that generation will need big history. I thank you for your attention.